My name is Stella. I am 30 years old, and I am a senior forensic accountant for a top-tier firm in Manhattan. I spend my days hunting down hidden assets, exposing corporate embezzlement, and analyzing the darkest corners of financial fraud. I am the person you hire when you want to know exactly where the money went. But in a twist of cruel irony, I never expected that the most consequential audit of my life would be performed on my own father, and the asset being devalued would be my own life. It began exactly 2 months ago, on a rainy Tuesday at 11:42 p.m. I was lying in the intensive care unit of St. Jude's Hospital, my body a landscape of trauma. A construction site accident, a collapsing scaffold that fell while I was conducting a site audit, had left me with severe cranial swelling and internal bleeding. I was hooked up to a ventilator, the rhythmic hiss of the machine the only thing keeping oxygen in my blood. My survival was a statistical coin toss, a 50-50 probability that the neurosurgeons were fighting desperately to improve. To any normal parent, seeing their child in that state would be a nightmare. But my father, Arthur, didn't see a tragedy. He saw a balance sheet in the red. He didn't ask the attending neurosurgeon about my brain activity or the likelihood of a full recovery. He didn't hold my hand or whisper words of encouragement. Instead, he walked straight to the nurse's station, his face set in a mask of grim determination, and asked to speak to the billing department. He wanted the numbers. When he heard the daily cost of the ICU care and the projected out-of-pocket expense for the necessary neurosurgery, roughly $180,000, he made a cold, executive decision. To Arthur, I wasn't a daughter fighting for breath. I was a depreciating asset, a bad debt that he had been carrying for 30 years. He picked up the pen with a steady hand. He looked the doctor in the eye, feigning a tremor in his voice to sell the performance of a grieving father, and said, "She has suffered enough. Let her go." He signed the Do Not Resuscitate, DNR order, at 11:42 p.m. He signed that paper not to end my pain, but to stop his financial bleeding. He treated my life like a failing subsidiary that needed to be liquidated before the fiscal quarter ended to protect the bottom line. He walked out of that hospital room believing he had just closed a difficult deal and secured his financial future. He thought he was cutting his losses. He didn't realize he had just declared war on the one person in the world who knew exactly how to track his every lie. To understand how a father could sign his child's death warrant over a hospital bill, you have to understand the family ledger I grew up with. Arthur wasn't just a father. He was a failed real estate mogul who viewed human relationships solely through the lens of return on investment, ROI. In our house, love was conditional, a commodity to be traded rather than given, and I was always in the red. The ledger had 2 columns. On one side was my older brother, Eric. He was the golden asset, charming, reckless, and constantly bailed out because he was the heir apparent. No matter how many cars he wrecked or businesses he tanked, Arthur saw him as a venture worth funding. I, on the other hand, was the bad debt. I was the unexpected expense, the overhead cost that kept dragging down the family portfolio. I remember the exact day this dynamic was cemented in my mind. I was 12 years old, recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia that had kept me in the hospital for a week. When I came home, weak and still struggling to breathe, I didn't find a welcome home banner. Instead, I walked into the kitchen to find the hospital bill magnet clipped to the refrigerator door at eye level. It was for $18,400. My father left it there for 3 years. Every time I reached for a glass of milk or an apple, I had to look at the price tag of my existence. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a weapon. He would sigh, point to the bold total, and say, "You know, Stella, that money was supposed to be for the new deck. You cost this family its summer comfort." I internalized that guilt deep in my bones. I grew up believing I was a financial burden that needed to be repaid. That is why I spent my 20s working 80-hour weeks, becoming a ruthless forensic accountant. I wasn't just chasing a career. I was desperate to earn enough money to finally buy my father's approval and clear my name from his ledger. I thought if I became successful enough, the debt would be forgiven. I didn't know then what I know now. To a narcissist, a debt can never be repaid. It can only be leveraged. In a world where my father priced every interaction, my Aunt Martha was the only person who offered love for free. She was Arthur's estranged sister, the family pariah who had committed the cardinal sin of choosing happiness over status. While my father spent his weekends at the country club networking with people he secretly despised, I spent mine in the dusty, cluttered sanctuary of Martha's used bookstore in the historic district. To Arthur, she was a failure. To me, she was the only one who didn't look at me like a bad investment. My father mocked her constantly. He called her property a rat's nest and would often joke at the dinner table about how he was impatiently waiting for her to die so he could finally bulldoze that eyesore and sell the land for a parking lot. He viewed her mortality simply as a pending real estate transaction. When Martha passed away from cancer 2 years ago, Arthur arrived at the reading of the will with a developer's surveyor already on speed dial. He was furious to learn she had bypassed him entirely. She left the bookstore and the prime corner lot it sat on directly to me. I remember the funeral vividly. Arthur cornered me by the hearse, his face twisted in a sneer disguised as concern. "It's just a pile of rotting bricks, Stella," he hissed, gripping my arm. "The property taxes alone will bankrupt you. Sign the deed over to me. I'll bulldoze it, sell the dirt, and put you out of your misery. It's the only way you'll see a dime from that junk." I refused. I told him I wanted to keep the store as a memorial. He laughed in my face, calling me sentimental and stupid. But I wasn't just being sentimental. I was being a forensic accountant. What Arthur didn't know, and what Aunt Martha had whispered to me on her deathbed, clutching my hand with surprising strength, was that the city council was secretly rezoning that entire district for high-end commercial development. I had gone down to the city archives and pulled the blueprints myself. That rat's nest wasn't worthless. With the new zoning laws set to take effect next year, the land value had skyrocketed overnight from a negligible sum to a staggering $850,000. It wasn't just a bookstore. It was my nest egg, my escape plan, and the one asset my father was desperate to get his hands on if only he knew it existed. The accident that shattered my reality happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was conducting a routine site audit for a construction client in the financial district, checking compliance logs against the physical structures. I remember the sound, first a screech of metal shearing against metal that pierced through the noise of the city rain, and then the sky seemed to fall. A section of scaffolding, improperly secured by a contractor cutting corners, collapsed directly onto my vehicle just as I was climbing inside. The world went black instantly. The injuries were catastrophic. The impact left me with a fractured skull, 3 broken ribs that punctured my lung, and severe internal bleeding. I was rushed to St. Jude's Hospital, unconscious and unidentified for the first critical hour, until the intake nurses found my wallet and dialed the emergency contact listed on my insurance card, Arthur. Any decent father would have broken speed limits to get to the hospital. Arthur arrived, but he didn't rush to my bedside to hold my hand. Security footage I later subpoenaed during my investigation showed his black sedan pulling into the emergency bay at 10:15 p.m. But he didn't get out. For 20 agonizing minutes, while surgeons were cutting open my chest to stop the bleeding, my father sat in his heated leather seat, making frantic phone calls. He wasn't calling family. He wasn't calling a priest. He was calling his creditors. I later learned that Arthur was in deep trouble. A speculative development deal he had leveraged everything on had collapsed that morning, and he was facing immediate calls on loans totaling nearly $500,000. He was drowning in debt, and he needed liquidity immediately to avoid bankruptcy or worse, the wrath of the loan sharks he had borrowed from. When he finally walked through the sliding glass doors of the ER and learned of my condition, the panic in his eyes shifted into something far darker: calculation. The doctors explained the gravity of my situation, the potential brain damage, the long road to recovery, the exorbitant cost of the specialized neurosurgery I needed. In that moment, Arthur saw a dark opportunity. If I survived, I would be a burden, an expensive, broken invalid that society would expect him, as my father, to support. But if I died, if I tragically succumbed to my injuries that night, the laws of intestacy were clear. Since I was unmarried and childless, my entire estate would pass directly to my next of kin. He did the math instantly. If my heart stopped beating, the worthless bookstore property now valued at $850,000 would legally become his. He could flip it to developers by Monday morning, clear his gambling debts, and still have cash to spare. My pulse wasn't a sign of life to him anymore. It was an obstacle to his solvency. And as he looked down at my broken body, he realized that the most profitable move he could make was to ensure I never woke up. Arthur made his move at exactly 11:42 p.m. With the flourish of a pen, he signed the Do Not Resuscitate order, effectively sentencing me to death. He looked the attending physician in the eye, feigning a heavy heart, and told him that he was my sole guardian. He claimed that I was a person who hated machines and would not want to be kept alive artificially. The doctor, bound by strict hospital protocol when no other next of kin is listed, reluctantly accepted the order. As Arthur walked out of the ICU, the nurses began the grim process of dialing down the life support. My father went home to sleep in his expensive sheets, confident that by morning, his financial problems would be solved by my funeral. But Arthur had made a critical miscalculation. He forgot that I am a forensic accountant. In my line of work, we don't operate on trust. We operate on verification and worst-case scenarios. I am professionally paranoid. 3 years ago, after I discovered Arthur had quietly siphoned off thousands from Aunt Martha's pension fund before she died, I realized that he was not a father, he was a predator. I knew that if I were ever incapacitated, he would strip me for parts. So, I had quietly drawn up a comprehensive estate plan, a poison pill defense for my own life. I had designated Lucas, my best friend since college, and a corporate attorney with a reputation for being a shark, as my durable healthcare proxy and power of attorney. I had filed the paperwork digitally, buried deep in my medical records, a failsafe waiting to be triggered. At 1:15 a.m., as my vitals began to drop, a vigilant night shift nurse noticed a flashing medical alert icon in my digital file that the intake team, in their rush to treat the trauma, had missed. She clicked it and saw Lucas's name in bold red letters. Primary contact. Do not consult father. She called Lucas immediately. Lucas didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He drove to the hospital in his flannel pajamas, breaking every speed limit in the city. He burst through the double doors of the ICU like a battering ram, slamming the notarized proxy documents onto the nurse's station desk with a force that made the monitors jump. If you let that woman die based on her father's signature, Lucas roared at the terrified resident on duty, I will sue this hospital into oblivion. I will own this building by sunrise. He revoked the DNR order at 1:58 a.m. The machines were ramped back up, the alarms were silenced, and I was rushed into the operating theater 10 minutes later for the life-saving craniotomy Arthur had tried to prevent. While surgeons worked feverishly to repair the damage to my skull, my father slept soundly through the whole thing, dreaming of the money he was about to steal, completely unaware that his liability was still breathing. I spent the next 2 weeks in a medically induced coma, floating in a dark, silent void. My body was a battleground where surgeons fought to repair my skull and stabilize my lungs, but I was unaware of the war being waged for my survival. While Lucas was standing guard by my bedside, protecting my physical life from the doctors who might give up on me, he couldn't watch every corner of my existence. He couldn't protect the life I had built outside those hospital walls. Arthur, having been thwarted in his attempt to let me die quickly via the DNR, decided he couldn't afford to wait for nature to take its course. He believed I was either as good as dead or would wake up with significant brain damage, a vegetable incapable of testifying against him. So, while I lay helpless, he executed a plan so brazen and calculated it would have been impressive if it weren't so morally bankrupt. He didn't waste a single hour. He went to my apartment under the guise of picking up personal items for my hospital stay. Instead of clothes, he ransacked my desk until he found my passport. With my identity in his pocket, he initiated the second phase of his scheme. He hired a woman, a desperate, drug-addicted paralegal from his own failing real estate office who vaguely resembled me if you didn't look too closely. He promised her a cut of the profits, dressed her in my clothes, and equipped her with my stolen passport. Together, they drove to a shady notary's office 3 towns over a place known for asking few questions and accepting cash payments. The security footage I later subpoenaed showed them walking in at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. The woman posed as me, her hands shaking slightly as she signed a specialized grant deed. With a single forged signature, she transferred the bookstore property, my nest egg, my future, to Arthur Vance for the nominal sum of $1. The speed at which he liquidated my legacy was terrifying. Within 48 hours of that fraudulent signature, Arthur used the new deed to secure a predatory hard money loan against the property. The lenders, seeing the prime location and the clean title, wired him $600,000 by Friday afternoon. He didn't use a cent of that money for my medical care. He took the cash and immediately paid off the loan sharks who had been threatening his knees. Then, in a display of breathtaking arrogance, he walked into a dealership and bought a brand new Porsche 911 to celebrate his business acumen. He drove around town, waving to neighbors, confident that he had pulled off the perfect crime. He had liquidated my entire life while I was helpless in a hospital bed, fully convinced that dead daughters tell no tales. He forgot that I wasn't just a daughter. I was an auditor, and he had just created a paper trail that I would follow straight to his throat. I finally woke up on a Tuesday morning, exactly 19 days after the scaffolding had crushed my car. The first thing I registered was the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the excruciating throb in my skull that felt like a hammer striking an anvil. My ribs screamed with every shallow breath, and my vision was a blur of sterile white light. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the story Lucas had to tell me. Sitting by my bedside, his face pale with exhaustion, Lucas explained everything. He told me about the DNR order signed at 11:42 p.m. He told me about the frantic legal battle to revoke it. And then, he dropped the final bomb. A neighbor had called him to say that a sold sign had appeared in the window of my bookstore 3 days ago. Most people in that situation would have shattered. Most daughters would have cried, screamed, or called the police immediately in a fit of rage. But as the sedative fog lifted, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a forensic accountant. My mind snapped into a cold, crystalline focus. In my line of work, emotion is a liability. Evidence is the only currency that matters. I knew that the police moved slowly, and that they would treat this as a civil family dispute without hard proof. I didn't want an investigation. I wanted a conviction. "Don't tell him I'm awake," I whispered to Lucas, my voice raspy from weeks on the ventilator. "Let him think the plan worked. Let him think I'm a vegetable." From my hospital bed, I turned my recovery room into a war room. With a laptop propped up on my knees, I accessed the county recorder's office online. I pulled the digital copy of the deed transfer. There it was. A signature that claimed to be mine, scrawled on a date when I was medically comatose. I tracked the notary stamp to a man named Carl, a disbarred paralegal with a known history of ethics violations. I didn't stop there. I pulled Arthur's credit report, something I had access to from a previous power of attorney he had foolishly granted me years ago and never revoked. I traced the hard money loan. $580,000 wired out to a known offshore gambling syndicate on Saturday. I built a case file against my own father, documenting every timestamp, every dollar, and every lie. He thought he had buried me, but he had actually just given me 19 days to dig his grave. Arthur was feeling invincible. With the $600,000 he had secured by fraudulently mortgaging my property, he had silenced the loan sharks and temporarily patched the holes in his sinking financial ship. He truly believed that the daughter problem was resolving itself toward a quiet, convenient death in a hospital room. Emboldened by his crimes, he decided to host a massive black tie gala to celebrate the 30th anniversary of his company, Vance Global. He invited 300 of the city's elite investors, developers, local politicians, and the press. The event was scheduled for this coming Sunday at the Grand Hotel's ballroom. His plan was audacious. He intended to announce his comeback and unveil the architectural renderings for a new luxury high-rise. He planned to build on the site of Aunt Martha's bookstore, the very land he had stolen from me while I was in a coma. It was the perfect stage for a narcissist. He wanted to be the center of attention. I decided I would give him the spotlight he craved, but I would control the illumination. I discharged myself from the hospital 2 days early, signing the against medical advice release forms with a hand that still trembled from muscle atrophy. When Lucas arrived to pick me up, he looked terrified. I was sitting in a wheelchair, looking less like a avenging angel and more like a ghost. I was pale, bruised, and fragile, with a healing incision hidden beneath a scarf. "Stella, you can't do this," Lucas pleaded, trying to wheel me back toward the elevator. "You need rest. Let me take this evidence to the district attorney. We can arrest him next week." "Next week is too late," I said, my voice raspy but cold. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. It wasn't a legal brief. It was a PowerPoint presentation I had spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting. It contained the time-stamped DNR, the side-by-side signature analysis proving the forgery, and the flow of funds to the gambling syndicate. "He tried to cancel my life to save money, Lucas," I said, looking at the digital evidence of my father's betrayal. "I'm not just going to sue him. I'm going to cancel his lifestyle, his reputation, and his legacy in front of everyone he tries to impress." Reluctantly, Lucas agreed. We didn't just plan to crash the party. We planned to hijack it. We drove to the Grand Hotel and coordinated with a contact I had found, a disgruntled AV technician who was all too happy to accept a $500 bribe. He gave us the encrypted access codes to the ballroom's main projector system and the Wi-Fi bridge. We parked in the loading dock, watching the live feed from the ballroom cameras on my laptop. Inside, Arthur was adjusting his tuxedo, smiling at guests, completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor. I sat in my wheelchair in the dark van, my finger hovering over the enter key. The trap was set. The gala was in full swing, a masterpiece of deception illuminated by crystal chandeliers. 300 of the city's elite sipped champagne, captivated by the man standing center stage. Arthur looked every inch the benevolent patriarch in his tuxedo, his face arranged in a practiced expression of noble suffering. He gripped the microphone, tears glistening in his eyes as he played the role of the grieving father to perfection. "My daughter Stella," he choked out, his voice cracking theatrically, "is fighting a losing battle in the hospital as we speak. I have spent every penny I have trying to save her, liquidating assets and taking on debt, because family is the only investment that matters. I would give everything just to hear her voice again." The crowd applauded his sacrifice, murmuring their sympathies. That was my cue. "Actually, Dad," my voice boomed through the ballroom speakers, cutting through the applause like a knife. "Let's check the receipts." The double doors at the back of the room swung open with a heavy thud. Lucas pushed my wheelchair into the ballroom. The silence that fell over the crowd was suffocating. My father froze, the microphone slipping slightly in his hand. He looked like he had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. I wasn't the daughter he remembered. I was the auditor he feared. "You claimed you spent every penny to save me," I said, my voice steady as Lucas wheeled me to the center of the room, parting the sea of stunned guests. "But the hospital records show a different story." I clicked the remote hidden in my lap. The massive projection screen behind him, which had been displaying a logo of his company, flickered and changed. It wasn't a tribute video. It was a high-resolution, blown-up image of the Do Not Resuscitate order. "Time of signature, 11:42 p.m., I read aloud, the numbers echoing in the silent hall. "Reason cited: financial burden. You didn't pay to save me, Arthur. You signed a paper to let me die to save $180,000. I clicked the remote again. The slide transitioned to a split screen. On the left, his bank statement showing a zero balance transfer to the hospital. On the right, the time-stamped log of him signing the order less than 20 minutes after arriving at the ER. "You treated my life like a bad line item on a balance sheet," I continued, staring him down as the color drained from his face. "You didn't liquidate assets to save your daughter. You tried to liquidate your daughter to save your assets." The room erupted in gasps, the sound sucking the oxygen right out of the ballroom. My father, realizing his narrative of the grieving hero was disintegrating, tried one last, desperate tactic: gaslighting. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisting into a mask of faux concern. "She's hallucinating!" he shouted over the murmurs of the crowd, looking frantically at his investors. "The accident affected her brain. She doesn't know what she's saying. This is just a delusion born of trauma." I didn't flinch. I just leaned into the microphone, my voice calm and icy. "Did the accident also forge my signature, Arthur?" I clicked the remote one last time, The screen behind him changed again. This was the kill shot. On the left was a high-resolution scan of my actual signature from my driver's license. On the right was the shaky, jagged scrawl on the property deed transfer signed while I was in a coma. Above them, a time-stamped video clip played on a loop. Security footage I had subpoenaed from the notary's office, clearly showing my father guiding a woman who was definitely not me. She was shorter, wearing a wig, and looking terrified as she signed the papers. "You signed my death warrant on Tuesday to save money," I declared, my voice ringing through the silent hall. "And you stole my property on Thursday to make money. You aren't a businessman, Arthur. You are a fraud." The fallout was instantaneous. The investors, men and women who prided themselves on their due diligence, stood up and turned their backs on him. It was a social execution. As the crowd parted, the side doors opened, and the police officers Lucas had been coordinating with stepped into the light. They didn't come with sirens, they came with handcuffs. My father tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. "You ungrateful brat!" he screamed as they read him his rights in front of the cameras he had hired. "I gave you life, and you tried to take it back for a tax write-off," I replied. Arthur left his own gala in handcuffs, charged with attempted fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. The empire he built on lies collapsed in seconds. In the months that followed, I recovered the bookstore legally. I didn't keep it, though. I sold it to a historical preservation trust for a massive profit money that my father had tried to kill for. I used those funds to start a foundation dedicated to helping victims of financial abuse recover their lives. I erased the debt he had convinced me I owed him. For 30 years, I thought my value was a number on his ledger, a negative balance I had to work off. But standing there, watching him get dragged away, I realized the truth. My worth wasn't something he could audit, and it certainly wasn't something he could liquidate. If you are watching this, and you've ever felt like a burden to the people who were supposed to carry you, remember this. You are not a bad investment. You are the asset. And sometimes, the only way to balance your books is to close the account on the people who cannot afford your value. My name is Stella. My ledger is finally clean. Thank you for listening to my story. If you believe in justice served cold, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of truth and resilience. And tell me in the comments, what is the one debt you are finally ready to let go of? I'll be reading your stories.